economy could make through the new tariffs, or lower tariffs than compared to today's tariffs, which are roughly on average between 7 and 35%, depending on the sector. But it also, of course, will increase the trade volume overall in various areas and various industries. Just one side note, Venezuela and Bolivia wouldn't be part of that agreement because regarding Bolivia, I think they've just recently had the access, or so that, just to mention that even without those two markets, the fore and center would give such a big opportunity for the Swiss companies. So, how do we do this? When we talk about the opportunities, we need to bring that somehow to the home run. Yeah, so it's not enough to just say there's the opportunity, but the question from a company perspective is, how do I do it? How do I get there? And this obviously is where Switzerland Global Enterprise is helping day in, day out. We are supporting roughly 6,600 companies per year in their export journey. And as I mentioned before, we never do this alone. In Latin America in particular, we have probably, talking about the different regions around the world, we have the biggest network of collaborations with our Swiss chambers. Yeah, so it used to be 14. Meanwhile, with the recent addition of yet another one, we have 15 agreements, so we have a pretty good coverage. And I think the point here is that even when we look at this coverage, when we look at the opportunities through the free trade agreements, and when we think again about the diversification that I've mentioned, we often help our customers. They go first, let's say, to Brazil, and then the next step is maybe another country like Chile. Yeah, so it's also this intercontinental expansion that falls into the category of diversification, which we have to make use of, especially in this current given situation. So that's just worthwhile mentioning. Some of you know that, of course. Some of you are here that are representing a chamber, one of our very close partners. But from a company perspective, that is an important part, that we always have the local representation and really can help in finding the right expert, finding the right distribution partner, etc., with the help at the end of either the chambers or our own local presence through our Swiss business hubs. How do we get there? Together, we do a lot of activities. So this is just an example of activities we are planning till the end of this year. And as you can see, whether it's a Swiss pavilion, whether it's forum, exhibition, whether it's a fact-finding mission or networking events, we always take an approach where we say it's a different scale or different bunch of activities that we offer, because not everybody, every company has the need for a fact-finding mission, but still wants to learn about a particular country. As you can also see, we cover a wide range of the various countries, so it's not about focusing just on one country, but it's important to really cover where the demand from the customer perspective is. And you do see a little focus, for example, on infrastructure, but also sustainability and mining, and that is, of course, driven by what we find in Latin America, and therefore where the biggest opportunities for Swiss technology also are lying. So a lot of activities. I haven't put on that list activities that would come along with the Mercosur signature, but of course, if that is coming true, then again we would design a lot of activities around Mercosur as well, be it webinars, be it a deeper explanation of the opportunities. So that would come on top of this. So overall, just to repeat again, I think a lot has changed. I think we still have a lot of opportunities. One thing, let's never forget, that hasn't changed: Swiss quality, Swiss attention to detail, Swiss precision technology, Swiss focus on innovation, a lot of things that really make a great match between Switzerland and Latin America. And with that, I do thank you for your attention. Muchas gracias, muito obrigada, and thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anja. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Again, congratulations to your appointment as CEO of SGE as of next summer. And it's a privilege for LATCAM to be part of Team Switzerland. Now, a logistical remark, may I ask all the speakers who are done with their session to go back to the technician and hand him your headphones so the others who come after you can get ready. And now I'm very pleased to announce our next speaker. Those of you who are here with us 3 years ago might remember his presentation. Please welcome with a warm applause Esteban Polidura from our patron bank Julius Baer.
Thank you very much. You know, I was thinking people often get it wrong, no? They think of Latin America and Switzerland as two opposing stories. One maybe a story of change and the other one a story of stability. One a story of production, the other one a story of consumption maybe, and definitely one a little bit more emerging and the other one developed. I think the reality is that those people that see the world in black and white often miss on opportunities, no? And in this sense, simply imagine, again, Latin America and Switzerland as two sides of the same coin, no? I can even picture that coin. On one front, stamped in golden letters, no? Confederación Latino-Helvética. Sounds perfect. Of course, in Spanish, we would keep Spanish, German, too difficult for us. And on the other, the symbol of our sovereign nation, let's say a smiling cow. And that coin would, of course, represent a country that I would be excited to have in real life, no? Imagine that country offering growth, flexibility, offering dynamism, and of course, security, rule of law, trustworthiness. And that's precisely what I think we need to do. We need to think of the world as a place that's offering us many things, and it is up to us to take the best that the world has to offer and combine it in such a way that we find the opportunities that we are looking for. And that's precisely what I will try to do with you today in the next few minutes, to share a view of the world, of course, from the eyes of Julius Baer, but of course also sharing with you the ideas, investment opportunities that we highlight often to our clients. And within the next few minutes, I hope you can take with you 3 key messages in this sense. The first one is that whether we like it or not, whether we see the news often that is negative, we were just speaking about that, the reality is that the world is doing okay. From a growth perspective, the economy in the world is doing okay. From an inflation point of view, even the tricky countries are doing okay. So now it is in the hands of central banks to keep that stability, to make sure that the world keeps doing okay. And funny, but it's not only on the economic side that the central banks are critical for. Actually, Julius Baer's Group Chief Investment Officer always uses the term, the tail is wagging the dog. In other words, the central banks need to make sure that whatever decisions they take also don't affect, financial markets. Because today there is so much money tied to financial markets that a wrong decision which hits the stock market, the bond market, will in the end affect the economy. So all now is in the hands of central banks, and we believe they have the capacity to do a good job. Second, because the world is doing well, companies are also reporting good numbers. Companies are reporting higher sales, increased cash flow. So it is in the best interest of companies to keep investing and in the best interest of investors to remain invested. Even though we often have, again, this news flow that might not be the best, The reality is that we need to remain invested. And why not? Even use some of those, bad news that often correct markets as entry points to keep building the positions that we care for. And I'm not only referring to investors, even companies, of course, can think of that this way. Finally, I know we've had a few weeks of stability, of no major negative surprises, and the market has gotten used to that. But believe me, the negative news flow will come again, the volatility will come again, and in those moments, it is critical for you as companies, as investors, to do one simple thing: to remain disciplined with your way of investing and to keep track of that diversification, to make sure you are diversified properly. The only thing that will save the day during those moments of instability is that diversification and the planning you did beforehand. So let's build the story a little bit behind this and go into the economic side of the equation. I said some countries are doing better than others, but in reality, even those that are not doing that well are doing okay. And here you have the case of the US. The US got us used to, the type of 2.5% to 3% growth rates that we saw over the last few years. This year, let me put this quote unquote, is not a good year for the US because it will only grow 1.5% according to our estimates. Well, 1.5% definitely is not bad at all. Slightly lower than last few years, but not bad at all. Why is it growing less than the last few years? And this chart shows this very clearly. What you see on this chart and on the bars is the kind of consumer spending that's taking place. You see that it is going up, definitely showing that consumers are spending. But look at the kind of spending. The spending is closer to the brown line than to the blue line. The blue line shows the average spending during economic growth years, like the one we are having today. And the brown line shows the kind of spending that takes place during recession years. And you can see that the bars are more aligned with the brown line than with the blue line. So why are consumers in the US spending like if the economy was in a recession? Why are they holding, actually this is a good number that I have for you, why are they holding cash 30% above what they did during COVID? Imagine, during COVID, they were getting checks, they could not spend the money, and today they have 30% more cash in hand. Why? I think the last word in the title says everything. They are exhausted. They are exhausted by a changing environment, by an administration that comes out every day with a different thing. Companies, of course, feel this, and therefore they are not hiring as they did in the past. Again, the US got us used to 100 to 200 new jobs created every month. I don't know if any one of you has the latest figure in your head, but it was 12,000. So from 200,000 to 12, what happened? And clearly the consumer in the US, which is critical, 2/3 of the US economy is held up by the consumer, is looking at this. And the consumer is not feeling confident enough to spend money. And that, of course, translates into an economy that doesn't grow as it should. But again, 1.5% is not a catastrophe. On the inflation side, the same thing. Not a catastrophic story, but not the best one. The US was posting inflation at about 2 to 2.5% over the last few years. This year and next, it should post inflation of about 3%. That's not, again, not a catastrophe, but not ideal. Why is inflation going up? Because of what we all know. Countries, we now saw a map of some countries with different tariffs. Now, bring this on a global scale. Countries are transferring to the US the tariffs that they are being charged with. Why? Because most of these countries know that the US cannot handle the kind of production that comes from them. We saw an example of Mexico producing cars. Well, the US is not able to produce cars right away in the amount that they need. Or I saw some months ago about tariffs to copper from Chile. If the US wanted to produce Chile on its own, it would take 5 years to set a new refinery, 10 years to extract copper from the ground. So countries are transferring the prices. So far, the transfer has not been too bad because those importers in the US have been absorbing most of those price increases. Why? Because they were able to cut costs, some expenses. They had a lot of inventories they built at the beginning of the year. So if you want to remember a little bit of your business administration lectures, first in, first out, so that inventory that they have been selling so far didn't have any tariffs, but that is slowly coming to an end. So for the rest of the year, you will see producers in the US transferring a lot more tariffs to the end consumer, and therefore inflation going up. Again, not to a level that you should worry too much about. Nevertheless, the Fed has been struggling with these two stories. On one front, the higher inflation, which calls for, high interest rates, or at least rates remaining where they are. And on the other front, the weaker labor market, and therefore the potentially weaker economy, which calls for rates coming down. So what to do? And this is what the Fed has been debating about over the last few months. Now everything seems to have come to an end. It seems that the economic side of the equation, the growth side of the equation, is the one that won. Therefore, the Fed should start lowering rates already as of this month, actually as of next week. By how much? Probably by about a quarter of a percentage point, 25 basis points. This month, maybe another one in October, another one in November. And with that, the Fed should start an easing cycle, lower rates, as you can see on the right-hand side. That means potentially more consumption, more economic growth, potentially more investments from companies, and of course, this is great news for financial markets because who doesn't like cheaper financing costs? Now, to put again things in perspective, the US story is not a bad one, it's simply not an ideal one. The thing is that on a relative basis, other regions and other countries are doing better. Here you have the example of Europe. Actually, if we've had this meeting maybe, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, I would have said that Europe was expected to remain flat in terms of growth this year, to show no growth basically. But now analysts, including our own analyst in Julius Baer, are expecting Europe to grow more than 1%. And if you remember, I said the US should grow at about 1.5%. Europe 1%. So now they are very close to each other. And again, over the last few years, the US was growing 2 to 3 times more than Europe. So what changed? What changed was simply that early this year, Germany had elections. You probably remember that. It was feared that a right type of party would win. It wasn't the case. A more moderate coalition won those elections, and that coalition came out immediately and announced a huge infrastructure spending plan. Germany had not spent, but actually the amount, $500 billion to be spent over the next few years. This is an amount never seen in Germany. Germany had actually not spent a relevant amount of money since the Second World War. So it was a drastic change, not only for Germany, but for the Eurozone. And add to that, that the Eurozone has not engaged in a trade war with the US or with other countries. So now we have Europe growing and without an inflation problem. And what about Asia? Well, just to mention the example of China. News flow in China is always mixed, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but in reality, I would say slightly better than worse. What's happening in China? In China, the consumer, believe it or not, with 5% growth, the consumer doesn't feel that confident, so the consumer is a little bit depressed. But on the other, because the consumer is a little bit depressed, you see that on the title, there is deflation taking place in certain sectors. So that means that China has become ultra competitive because of that deflationary environment. And that means, on an economic basis, whatever consumption is not providing to GDP growth, exports are more than compensating. So China is growing, should grow at about 5% this year, and let's not even talk about India, growing closer to 7%. So Asia, again, is a region that's showing growth. So, in summary, we have the not ideal US story with lower growth, higher inflation, lower rates, rates that need to come down, and on the other side, the story in Europe and Asia, which is fairly good. The US dollar is a perfect thermometer for this. No? It has been showing the effects of these relative stories pretty well. Actually, the US dollar has depreciated against major developed market currencies by about 12% this year. That's huge, 12% US dollar depreciation because of this. Now, maybe the question, and speaking about opportunities, which I mentioned at the beginning, what do we expect going forward? Should we expect some of that weakness to revert? Should we expect more weakness? Simple answer here, more weakness ahead. How much? About 5 to 7% more depreciation of the US dollar against major developed market currencies. Why? Yes, on one front, we still have that challenging political and geopolitical environment, but on the other, now the US and the currency has to reflect the higher debt that comes along with Trump's recently approved One Big Beautiful Bill. You probably remember that. That bill, yes, has more spending to provide for higher growth, but the reality is that it will increase debt by about 12, 13% without providing a 12 to 13% boost to growth. So that means that the leverage ratios for the US are only going to deteriorate. Today, the US has debt to GDP of about 115, 120%, and estimates show that it should go to 135, maybe even more. So, who's winning from all of this? The Swiss franc, if you want to see it that way, is actually bearing a lot of the benefits from this. I know that for exporters, that might not be the case, but look at this chart. This chart shows the kind of performance of the Swiss franc against the euro. Basically, it's the same chart against the US dollar over the last 25 years. And what can you see there? That the Swiss franc only appreciates against the euro and the US dollar by about 2 to 3% each year. And this is with a stable environment, without Trump there. So now, with the kind of story that I was sharing with you, plus the political uncertainty, it is fair to assume that the Swiss franc will appreciate even more than the historical averages that we are used to. Remember one thing, and don't think of this lightly. The US, there is an ongoing debate among investors about the US still remaining a safe haven or not. If I were to ask each of you what you think, maybe I would get 50-50% answers. But if I were to ask you if you think if Switzerland is a safe haven or not, probably 100% would say yes. And that's true. The reality is that for a country to be thought as a safe haven, imagine it as a chair, it has to have 4 pillars supporting that story. One is stable and predictable economic growth. So I said that right now in the US, we don't have that. Second, low inflation. We don't have that right now in the US. Third, and I'm getting to trickier territory, independent institutions. I'm sure all of you have been following what's happening at the Fed. And finally, rule of law. The issue now here is that in the US, whenever President Trump wants to pass things without Congress or without anyone having an opinion on that, he basically signs an executive order. And that plays against the rule of law and the thinking behind that. So we have winners as the Swiss franc. Again, even though the Swiss National Bank has, brought the reference rate to 0, it actually doesn't matter for investors who are looking for a safe haven. Now, how can investors, again, I said at the beginning, find opportunities in this kind of environment? Well, in terms of fixed income investments, there are huge opportunities. And the first one, thinking about the US losing that, safe haven characteristic, the first one is, why not reduce the sovereign bond holdings in your portfolios, the US Treasury holdings in your portfolios, reduce them to have more exposure to corporate bonds. Remain in that investment grade area to keep quality as high as possible, but move risk from US sovereign to corporates. And there, of course, US companies are an option, but why not European companies too? In other words, why not having European corporate bonds in your portfolios? I know yields are slightly lower, but you have the boost coming from the currency appreciation. If you are interested, our analysts expect the US and the euro to trade at 124 in the next 12 months. So there you have it. At least another 6-7% currency appreciation, plus whatever the bonds can offer. Definitely an opportunity to diversify beyond the US. Equities even more. And again, this doesn't mean that you should leave the US because everything is bad. No, I said at the beginning, we need to train ourselves not to think about the world in black and white. And when we think about equities, that means that there are stories in the US that need to be part of investors' portfolios. Which are those stories? The exceptional ones, the ones that you cannot find easily in other regions, in Europe or in Asia. I'm sure a lot of you are already thinking about IT companies, the Magnificent Seven, definitely. You cannot find those kind of companies with those kind of growth rates, cash flow generation in Europe or in Asia. So when we think of the equity side of investors' portfolios, they should definitely hold US IT companies, but why not then use the chance to diversify the rest into other markets? Which markets? Well, I was saying, if Germany is going to have a very active infrastructure spending plan over the next few years, then definitely Germany and the industrial side of Germany makes sense. Plus, you diversify into the euro. Switzerland. Clearly, Switzerland is an option, especially the more medium-sized companies, which are more exposed to the Swiss consumer, selling in Swiss francs, and also more exposed to the European region, benefiting from that spending taking place. So Switzerland. In developed markets, Japan. There are a lot of news flow coming from Japan, but basically Japan is having not only a revival on the economic side, but also there are structural reforms taking place, especially for stock markets. Good reforms. And outside these developed markets, I already said China makes sense to hold in the portfolio on a tactical basis, and India likewise. Now, we spoke about bonds, we spoke about stocks. There is definitely also an option to diversify beyond those asset classes. And in that sense, I think gold needs to be part of every investor's portfolio. Look at this chart. It's very easy to read. The light purple lines show the kind of gold demand coming from central banks. Basically, central banks are demanding, you know this figure, I cannot even really imagine it, are demanding 100 to 200 tons of physical gold every month. Every month. To do what with the gold? Basically, to replace US Treasury bonds in their reserves for gold. Why? Because they don't want to run the political risks from holding US Treasury bonds. Especially China, which has become the largest gold buyer in the world already for a long time. But also look at the dark blue lines. The dark blue lines show the kind of gold demand coming from traditional investors. Mutual funds, pension funds, retail investors, you can see they have also turned positive. They are also demanding gold. Why? Because they are demanding something to diversify their risk. They are safe haven seekers. So to conclude, here you have an example of 3 model portfolios. The one on the left for an investor that is risk averse, doesn't like a lot of risk. The one on the right, a model portfolio for an investor who likes to take risk. And in the middle, a balanced type of portfolio for an average type of investor. What can you see on these charts? Basically, the stories that I already shared with you. And let's start from bottom to top. At the bottom, you can see a tiny blue line with a 5%, which is the holding we recommend in gold, again, for every and any portfolio. 5% of your portfolio invested in gold. Second, what you can see in the middle of the charts is a large blue line for the balanced portfolio with a 54% stake, and that is what we suggest in terms of holding equities, stocks. That tells you that we are overweight equities, that we are positioned to take risks, because we don't think the current environment is one where we should have money hidden under the mattress. It is an environment where we should have a smart allocation of that money into the stories that might play well in the next few months. All the brown lines that you see are the kind of individual stories that make up the blue line on top of them. These are the stories that we discussed. Finally, the line at the top of all those charts, the liquidity line. You can see that for the balanced portfolio, we are still holding around 6% in cash. Why so much cash? Because at any point in time, for any reason, you should expect markets to correct. Markets can correct easily 5 to 10% and still remain in a bull market. That 5 to 10% correction anytime wouldn't change our positive view of financial markets that we have. It would only mean that that is an opportunity to go out and buy the stories that need to be in your portfolios. That's the stories that you have been tracking. So, ladies and gentlemen, I said at the beginning, La Confederación Latino-Helvética and the world are open for business, and it's up to us to be ready to seize those opportunities. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Gracias, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Esteban, for your valuable assessment and positive outlook. That's what we like. Now, our next, and before I go to the next session, just in case you're wondering, all the presentations, the slides that you see today, we will have them posted on our website under the event. And this whole afternoon is recorded for our YouTube channel, LatCam Switzerland, so whoever was not able to assist here the whole afternoon can see it later in your own time. And now our next session is a panel discussion with some tradition that will focus on the government side. I'm honored to welcome here on the stage our panelists, Minister Hervé Lohr from SECO, a board member and good friend of LATCAM, Minister Markus Roten from the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, with us for the first time, welcome, and our one and only Honorary Ambassador, Dr. Philippe Nel, who will moderate the discussion. Please welcome them with a round of applause.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, very pleased to be back here today with all of you. Thank you for your participation today. We're very happy to have all of you. And I am delighted to welcome this year for the first time Minister Markus Roten, and for the sixth time Hervé Lohr from SECO. Thank you very much. We live in a period of deep disruption with significant geopolitical tensions. In the trade area, we'll focus on the trade area with this panel. The United States has broken the multilateral pact set in 1947 with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and with the World Trade Organization in 1995. With a stroke of a pen, the US has changed the rules of the game with its partners. The shock has been significant, mainly because the US accounts for 13% of world imports. The medium-term consequences are still to be seen for the US and for the world. Economic history shows us that the most open countries are the most competitive. Size does not matter. Short-term gains brought by protectionism do not turn into long-term gains. What does this disruption mean for the Swiss-Latin American relations, for the world growth, and for multilateralism? Our discussion will be in two parts this afternoon. First, the panelists will focus on the impact of US policies on Latin America and on how Switzerland could contribute to alleviate that impact. And second, the panelists will take a look at the latest developments in Swiss-Latin American bilateral relations. So let me start first on the impact of US policies on Latin America and the Swiss contribution on that. I will start with Markus Roten. President Trump's campaign has been dominated by a few issues, including migration, inflation, and trade. His immigration policies have a strong impact on Latin America. The reintegration of immigrants returning to Latin America represents a big challenge in countries facing poverty and unemployment, organized crime, and violence. How could Swiss foreign policy provide some support?
Thank you very much, and first of all, thank you for having me here for my first time. I hope my ambassador, Paul Saint-Weffrey, who brings his apologies as well, gives me another excuse to come here in the future as well. So thank you very much for having me. Yes, I think when we look at the US measures and the topic of migration, I think it's also, again, important to see that it doesn't only affect Latin America. A recent example actually shows that when 475 workers from the Hyundai plant in Georgia who were doing their car batteries got taken into custody, and then they had to then afterwards be checked for their immigration status, or still are, that it can affect everyone, and also G20 members like South Korea. And I'm happy that our embassy at the moment can concentrate on other things than prisoner visitors in the United States. But this said, I think it is important to distinguish between regular mobility, then the refugee status, and also irregular migration. The migration in Latin America is not only a challenge, but also offers opportunities, namely for business mobility and also skilled workforce. Like in Switzerland and Europe, we face similar political sensitivities that need to be taken serious. Switzerland has 400,000 cross-border commuters every day. The free movement of persons with the EU and the migration from third countries. So also for us, it's not easy to strike this right balance, also with our domestic politics. And the same can be said also for Latin America. Migration is a major challenge within and between these countries in the region, triggered by social inequality, violence, political persecution, and climate change. And as we heard from the president, these people need protection from gender-based violence, exploitation through human trafficking, and they need the support with basic services like food, water, and shelter. And this is where Switzerland comes into play, and and is engaged at the regional level, addressing causes and consequences of displacement, providing humanitarian aid, promoting social integration of migrants, and supporting international organizations and NGOs like the UNHCR or IOM. If we have time, I can happily say something a bit more on that. And then I think important is always, like we do in Switzerland, is to identify the needs of the own economy in Latin America, and then channel migrants to specific sectors where the own national workforce is insufficient. And lastly, I'd like to say that Switzerland is investing in economic development. That's something which we also do very closely with SECO and SGE, which we heard before, and the promotion of dialogue in conflict-affected countries. That's a bit more what we as a foreign ministry do. And Switzerland wants to contribute to regional stability in general. And it's not only a moral duty, I think, that we have, but it's also for our export-orientated companies which are here in the room. And I had to smile to myself before when I heard from our previous speaker his framework conditions, and I can subscribe to every one of them. But I still remember also a state secretary which I was allowed to accompany from time to time to the US when we were talking more around topics of banking secrecy. And he said one of the main factors, or the three main factors for Switzerland is stability, stability, and stability. Now, we heard the financial stability just before from a colleague from Julius Baer. I gave a bit of a political stability pitch, and then afterwards we'll hear about the economic stability, and he's probably in the hottest seat at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, you mentioned that Switzerland does contribute to alleviate some of the hardships linked to these migration flows now, which are based on the US policies sending illegal migrants back home. You also said that some international organizations do contribute. Switzerland is a small country. We can't do it all on our own, indeed. And what do you see in terms of international organizations playing a role on that?
Well, I think they have a very important role. In Latin America, we when it comes to international organizations, the Swiss engagement is with two organizations, the Organization of American States mainly, and then also with the Inter-American Development Bank. Switzerland is an observer of the OAS. We focus our engagement in strengthening democracy and human rights, for example, by sending experts to OAS election observation missions. We were just recently, for example, in Jamaica on one of these missions. And further, Switzerland is supporting the OAS mission to support the peace process in Colombia with the deployment of experts. And then coming to the Inter-American Development Bank, this is a priority partner for Switzerland as the largest multilateral financing mechanism in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there we also work to finance projects which mainly contribute to the 2030 agenda and its sustainability goals, which at the moment are a bit less in a high course, especially because of the US as well, but still remain important for our future generations. And Switzerland also stays engaged in the conferences in the Latin American region, like the important COP30 in November in Belém in Brazil. So there'll be a big Swiss delegation going over there as well. At a global level, maybe just to since I was talking about migration, the UNHCR and IOM, the International Organization for Migration, are key partners for us when it comes to the protection of migrants. And these agencies play an important role in the also in the economic integration of migrant workers, for example, in Colombia and Venezuela. As you know, both of these organizations are based and have their headquarters in Geneva. And so we also have our role as Switzerland to play towards our international Geneva. This is also something which is important to us. There again, coming back to the US, there are implications and impacts from the reduction in US contributions to international organizations in Geneva. And I think it's an important strategy, again, of my government and they have now deployed more money to sustain and help International Geneva to continue its work, mainly for humanity and multilateral cooperation, but then also for as a global innovation hub in the interface of diplomacy, science and technology, which we also already heard a few times today is becoming more and more important. So I encourage all our diplomatic colleagues here as well to stay engaged with International Geneva and to defend your interests also there. I think that's your main job you'll have.
No, thank you very much. It's very positive to see that following the drastic and very quick measures taken end of January by President Trump, that Switzerland and also the international community also reacted in alleviating the hardship of these people and helping them to be reintegrated in their respective countries. Now, let me turn to Hervé Lohr, and with you, Hervé Lohr, we are going to talk about trade, and in trade perspective, we have seen earlier this afternoon that the reciprocal tariffs for Latin America are about 10% for quite a number of countries. Indeed, most of the Latin American countries have even less than 10% because there are exceptions. The number of products are accepted. Argentina, it's 8% if you take the average weighted by trade. Colombia is 6.6, Peru is 7.4. Dominican Republic is a bit more, 11.3, because there are less exceptions. On the contrary, you have steel with 25%, which pushes it up. But there are two countries which raise some concern for us, and these are Brazil and Mexico. And Brazil, indeed, we have seen there is a 50%, but by trade weight average, it's much less because there are quite a number of exceptions, as we have seen early this afternoon, with fruit, with orange juice, civil aircraft parts, and so on, and so forth. Thus far, this year, our exports to Brazil have not done too well. They are down by 3.7%. And looking at this situation now, to which Brazil is exposed, Brazil is responding. Brazil has a program. Brazil is negotiating right now with the United States. But for the time being, Brazil is faced with this particular situation in quite a few specific sectors, like Switzerland, where the implications are very high. Now, how do you see the implications for... We have about 300 to 400 Swiss firms who are present in Brazil. And how do you see the implications for them being put into that particular environment of significant tariff increases by the United States?
Thank you, Philippe, and thank you also for having me here today. I think it's worth recollecting that Brazil, together with Mexico, as you mentioned, are our most important partners. In Latin America, I think trade is about 4.7 billion USD. We have, you mentioned it, a number of companies in Brazil that account for nearly 100,000 jobs in Brazil. Brazil, I'd say 50% is a huge impact, of course. At the same time, you need to look at the fact that before tariffs have been impacting Brazil, that already the projection for growth in Brazil were kind of slowing down. There is a combination of a soft demand, probably consumer internally or externally towards external markets, plus the tariffs that are, by the way, also kind of, the roots are also in political discussions. It's not only trade and rebalancing trade and getting, kind of concession from Brazil. But there are, as you know, some political elements to that, which is something totally new that we're experiencing now for 6 months, and not only in the case of Brazil. So I'd say the projection is slowing down when it comes to growth, which means that that's a kind of environment our companies will face. And what is also, when you look at the environment, generally speaking, and I think in the case of Brazil it is important, as it is in the case of all the BRICS. You have to look at this now as the BRICS together, the BRICS with the South with the BRICS, trying to face the US challenges. And that is not something that will just stay for the next 6 months or for the next year, but I assume that's something of a kind of epochal drift. And we should be well aware of that. We should look at this as something very structural for the 10 years to come, at least. And that would drive other questions than just the ones we were mentioning here. I would say that's what I'm saying to Brazil. Brazil will remain an important market for us in the region. That's of course the case. And you just have to look at the investments level in Brazil also, which are quite impressive when you look at overall Latin America.
Yes, I think it's a very good point that you mentioned the BRICS in the particular context, because when you look at Latin America right now, you find very, very nice growth rates all across. Like I think Argentina is on 5.5 and so on. Very nice growth rates, except Brazil and Mexico. But also, what you see, and linked to the geopolitical tensions that we face today, is that for Latin America, what's going to be essential in the next coming years is China. China will be able to grow pretty fast or not, because for Latin America, China is the #1 export market, particularly for raw materials, food, and so on and so forth. So that in that context of geopolitical tensions, there are many interdependencies. And the China-United States conflict, depending how it moves up in terms of these tariffs and squeezing the other ones, having an impact on China's growth, would then have also an impact on Latin America growth, which could be quite substantial. So it's very good to make the link with the BRICS, because that's a very important link that we have to consider now for the future. And now if we turn to Mexico, it's a bit different situation. Well, Brazil had a 1.8% growth forecast for this year. Brazil and Mexico, zero growth for this year. And we see that our exports to Mexico now have declined by 8.8%, January to July, which is quite significant. And on the top of that, there is for Mexico, a 25% customs duty we have seen earlier this afternoon, but effectively it's 12.9 if you take out all the exceptions for Mexico. So how do you see this trade relationship with Mexico? Do you see that we can kind of recover for the next coming years from the drop that we are facing right now, with quite a few coincidences playing together?
Well, thank you for this. I think when you look at Mexico, there is one institutional element that is extremely important and that we should never, never, never forget, is Mexico is part of the USMCA. When it comes to trade, that's extremely important. Second fact that I see when it comes to Mexico, I think they are at about 25% tariffs, despite the fact that President Sheinbaum did an extremely good job on the psychological, level of the discussion with the US. Mexico has been engaging properly, seriously, professionally. What I see, nevertheless, is the issue that, of course, Mexico has diversified a lot with China over the last years. Not so much from the trade perspective, but you have to look at the investments perspective. And that will remain probably whatever administration in the future is in power in the US. It will remain a very important factor that I'm not sure that US are going to accept like this. So there will remain a certain level of tension. On the same side, you've been looking certainly at different statements of different industries in the US that are absolutely relying on goods from Mexico when it comes to trade. And there is a strong checkup of reality for the US. So that will remain a field of tension. I don't know how that will unfold after that. What I see on the horizon, and there is an opportunity also for Switzerland and the EFTA, is certainly that this kind of stalemate that we've been experiencing over the last years in trying to modernize the FTA with Mexico is probably not going to repeat itself for the years to come, but rather we might have an opportunity, because of the positioning of the US right now towards Mexico, to get a chance in terms of diversification. That's always, when people always discuss about free trade agreements, they tend to think, yeah, it's just a question of will. No, it's a question of trade-off and balance. You know that we have a very defensive interest in the agricultural policy. For the time that I see, that will remain, despite the fact that probably the general environment in Switzerland will offer a possibility to have, and I wish that, a stronger discussion over these kind of issues. On the other hand, a country like Mexico, like that has been the discussion as well. I see the ambassador of Argentina in the room. A discussion with the FTA, with Mercosur. These countries, they have strong offensive interest when it comes to agriculture. Nothing new around the block, but the shift, the geopolitical shift that you're experiencing today are probably opening certain, angles for a positive discussion with Mexico. That's what we wish.
Okay, thank you very much. No, indeed, I think that the rates Mexico is exposed to should enable our companies who are now in Mexico and export to the US to continue doing business. For instance, I was talking to Nestle some time ago in Mexico, and they were telling me they are producing in Mexico lots of food products for the 25 million Mexicans or descendants living in the United States. And therefore, if it's a plus 10% tariff, you cut it off 5 and 5, importer, the producer, and you simply continue to keep your market. And this is what is likely to be the case with Mexico. Now, let me come on part 2 of our panel. Latest development in Swiss Latin American relations. We are going to focus down now on Switzerland. And let me turn back to you, Markus. Switzerland pursues presently a foreign policy strategy for the 2024-27 period. And I'd just like to review a couple of elements. Democracy and good governance is an important pillar of the Swiss foreign policy, with the promotion of international law and human rights. What is your assessment of the situation in Latin America, and what actions were taken by Switzerland during the past year?
Thank you for that question. I think Latin America is a diverse region, like we like to have it in Switzerland as well, with our unity in diversity. And Switzerland shares values such as democracy and human rights, which you've mentioned, with many countries in the region. A number of Latin American states participated also in a high-level summit on peace in Ukraine, on the Bürgenstock, as we call it, in June 2024. And this was and still is much appreciated by the Swiss government. I think we are surely not exaggerating when we say that the Americas are the most like-minded region to Europe when it comes to respect of democracy, rule of law, good governance, human rights. And so I think we are natural partners in this sense, and also to the stability factors, which have been already mentioned a few times this afternoon. However, it's always something you have to take care of and nurture, and you can't take it for granted. And we also can't close our eyes to worrying dynamics. The civil society is faced with shrinking space and budgets. Civil liberties are not respected everywhere. And the separation of powers is not always as clear-cut as maybe Montesquieu thought it back in the days. So what is certain now is that the narrative of the whole world moving towards democracy is no longer applicable, and Latin America is not an exception in this sense. I think China, we've already heard before, is not only economically but also politically increasing its footprint in Latin America, and I think the US is well aware of this, as was mentioned as well. Just recently now, the military deployment of the US in the region is a sign that the US wants to keep its influence in the immediate neighborhood, just as China is doing the same in the Southeast Asian thing. So we're having these kind of dynamics on both sides. As you mentioned, democracy and human rights is a pillar of the Swiss foreign policy strategy. We are implementing this pillar with partners all around the world, where we feel that there is a mix of challenges and encouraging signs, and I think Latin America fits perfectly into this description. And that's also the reason why Switzerland has recently deployed a democracy advisor to Latin America, who starts to work with selected countries to prevent democratic institutions from backsliding, but we want to help them to move forward. And this new colleague, Yannick Baer is his name, is based in the Swiss embassy in San Jose in Costa Rica. So that's a very concrete example of our contribution in the region.
Yes, thank you very much. No, I think it's important to explain democracy. Switzerland is an old lady, more than 700 years old. So indeed, and we had experiences, you know. It has taken some time also to come up to the system that we have today, which is very specific to us. And a final point, your strategy also encompasses the sustainability of the cooperation programs and projects. At the end of our cooperation in 2024, where we have phased out programs in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Haiti. How did the phasing out take place?
I think yes. I mean, it was a withdrawal from bilateral programs that was conducted according to the principle of responsible exit, to give partners time to achieve their goals as well, and to have transitions mechanisms up, make adjustments, and also to find alternative financing for the project partners in the region. And that resulted in the sense that numerous projects were then afterwards transferred to other organizations, where sometimes also indirectly Switzerland is still financing and helping. Interesting there, also a colleague told me that there was a capitalization process that was carried out over the 60 years of engagement in the Latin American region that we did, the lessons learned, and this was also shared then afterwards with the OECD Development Assistance Committee in Paris. So I think that's also important to, once you hand over and transfer things, that you also, like with us and our jobs, that you do a good handover. Especially diplomats should know this, and then to give their new colleagues. I was just also now very grateful for my predecessor to do a good handover to myself, and I think that's the same when you phase out from development aid. Nevertheless, Switzerland stays engaged, especially with humanitarian funds to respond to the crisis contexts, like in Haiti, but also Colombia and Venezuela. And at the regional level, the Swiss thematic cooperation focuses on the topics like climate change, water, and disaster risk management.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let me go back to Hervé. During the past 6 years, I asked the same very question to Hervé. He could never smile. Today, he can smile. Where do we stand with Mercosur? And congratulations for your team.
Well, it's not necessarily only my team. I think there are many people that are the mother of victory here. Look, yes, that's good news in a very dim context, I would say. 16th of September will be the date of signing in Rio. So it's next week. We intend to be as swift as possible when it comes to, ratification process. But of course, it takes a little bit of time, so I don't expect that agreement to be in force for a year and a half. We will see if we can implement the agreement on a provisional basis. That's certain. Now you certainly want to have some news, and I will not speak, but read, to be precise, what's in this agreement. So the agreement removes tariffs on industrial goods from EFTA and gradually eliminates duties on more than 95% of EFTA exports to Mercosur, so that's a good covering, creating significant opportunities for sectors such as the classical one: pharmaceuticals, machinery, chemicals, textiles, and car parts. Agricultural trade is open through tariff preferences and tariff rate quotas, giving EFTA countries better access for cheese, coffee, wine, spirits, and meat, while offering Mercosur concessions for a wide range of products, for example, beef, poultry, pork, and ethanol. Services are broadly liberalized across business, for example, telecom, financial, and transport sectors. Intellectual property protection is also strengthened. There is a certain caveat, but it's strengthened overall, covering copyright, trademarks, industrial designs, and safeguardings over 110 Swiss geographical indications, such as Gruyère prints, wines, chocolates, and watches over time.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's a great menu that you're offering us, and our economy, our companies will be fond of when it comes into force. Next year it goes to Parliament, and then by 2027, through the year, it's going to come into force, maybe also on a preliminary basis, depending on the content and what the Federal Council can propose. There's another question for you before we come to the audience. It relates to the World Trade Organization, which is happening now with the United States, who used to be the leader. They've been leading the organization now since many, many years, and until President Trump came back. And what does it mean for the organization? Can we come out of the crisis?
Well, look, I think we all have to recollect properly. More than 80% of the world trade is according to the WTO rules. It is extremely important to get that in mind for the years to come, The US are covering 13 to 15%. That means the rest of the world can and will have to work together. And that means also that the friend of the systems in the WTO will have a lot of work ahead of today's and the last 6 months to maintain the system. This system is extremely important for exactly what we have been mentioning before, stability and the rule of law. If you depart from that, if the international community is departing from that, that's a jungle. And that's before the Second World War. And nobody wants that. So I mean, this is an extremely strong message that we deliver. I want to also pass following message. It is important to remind that inside the multilateral system, you have different fora and different agreements that can be engaged at the plurilateral level, and we need to do so. For example, right now we have something on e-commerce and investment facilitation at the WTO. We should pass this through. And if one member, despite the fact that this member is as important as it is, and this member is one of the founding father, if not the father of all the system that we know after the Second World War, we need to see the change coming, to face it, and to work on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I have been more than 100 times at WTO for meetings, and I have experienced the leading role of the United States to push for decisions, to push for following the rules and discipline. And what we have to hope is that there will be a new leader coming out. Yes, maybe Switzerland or the European Community, European Union, which both are very inclined to have a strong WTO. Now I think we could come to the audience for questions. Please, questions? Any question? I was told we have 2 questions.
Hello? Yes. Hi. Yes, I have a question regarding the treaty with Mercosur. So Switzerland has, with several countries, Latin America, bilateral investment treaties. Some of them are quite old. Does the current agreement, which is supposed to be signed on the 16th of September, provide for replacing these bilateral investment treaties, or do they still remain in place?
Thank you for that question. When you negotiate an FTA, it's a market access agreement. So when you discuss investment in that context, you discuss market access in investment, meaning that when it comes to protection, and that's exactly as you kind of alluded to, the separate agreements prevail. And that will be the case here. Because to my knowledge, there is no discipline as to investment protection in the FTA with Mercosur.
I can confirm that because I used to be together with SECO in negotiating investment protection treaties as well, so there is a distinction between the two, yes.
Yeah, no, the reason I ask is because Europe is also concluding an agreement, and that does have certain provisions inside which supersede then the bilateral agreement.
That's correct, because the EU, over time, the last 15 years, if I'm not mistaken, had a slight shift from the sovereignty of countries, EU member states, towards investment protection issues, towards more market integration, also sovereignty now, or competence of the EU, and that's why you have that kind of disciplines in the EU FTA that are trade agreement in a broader sense.
Okay, thank you.
Well, next question, please.
Yes, I didn't follow through much of the detail, but I heard at one point in time mentioned that the Mercosur agreement would be submitted to a referendum in Switzerland. Is that the case?
Say, well, you know, it's always difficult to predict things in the future, as you know. Now, my sense is the following. We've been following that for many, many years, more than 6 years, actually. I can't remember how long it was, but I think it's about 10 years discussion. It's not as long as the European Union. And I think the concern in Switzerland has been, over time, the concern over sustainability. Switzerland had a difficult experience with the referendum, with the FTA, with Indonesia on these issues. It was more specific on the palm oil, and the debate was more specific than even sustainability. But if you followed all the discussion in the public, in the newspaper, in social media, in the last 15 years, when it comes to Mercosur and when it comes to Europe, you see a certain unbalance. I'm not judging that. It's just an unbalance, and it's a different perception about sustainability. I think there are two important shifts, again, geopolitical, that are affecting that potential discussion. The first one is Ukraine. Not Switzerland, this continent is still trying to grasp with that reality, despite the fact that we are 3 years down the road with this conflict. And the second one is the election of Donald Trump for the second time in the White House. And that means that concerns of the public are slowly shifting towards, it's a little bit like if you look at the debate over nuclear energy, we're starting to rediscuss in Switzerland this kind of issues that were off the table after Fukushima and after the Federal Council made decision over atomic nuclear energy. So it's not an absolute answer that I can give you, but I think that's about the kind of room we are ourselves right now in. Time will tell.
Maybe can I just add to that, since I mean, you know, it's a facultative referendum, so you only need about 50,000 signatures. And as the example that Hervé just mentioned, you know, it can be sometimes just an NGO or a certain civil society group which has a particular interest, which can be a small part of a big free trade agreement, but then can still make their democratic rights work and improve that. I'd still say that the agriculture lobby, I wouldn't say that's a small one, but a pretty big one in Switzerland. They will also be closely looking and analyzing that as well. So it's always something. I mean, the tough negotiations were now, but sometimes even the tougher negotiations are still ahead, where you have to sell it to your own parliament. And I wish Hervé good luck with that, with his team and Roger Schwen. But I can assure you, it won't be us two which will be going around Switzerland looking for signatures. That's I think we can say.
That we can say. That we can say. And I think that's important that you mentioned. I think even if the, and I guess the referendum will come, but I think I was more looking at what could be the result of such a votation. And I'd rather be much more confident today than I would have been 4 or 5 years ago. And I think I see the ambassador of Argentina nodding because we've been discussing these issues quite a lot. Thank you.
No, I think indeed that 5, 6 years ago, we had quite a concern that with Mercosur, we would run into a referendum and that it could be very, very difficult. However, today, the situation has changed. And take India. We had no referendum for India. And with India, there are also some very sensitive issues. So now with Mercosur, I think we can be quite confident that things will work out well and that the agreement will come into force in about 18 months to 24 months. So I think that we had a very interesting panel again this afternoon, and I would like to thank my two panelists, Marcus Watton and Hervé Lohr, and give you rendezvous for next year, same time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci à toi.
Merci, Philippe. Thank you so much.
And one for Philippe.
So if there are any more questions to our panelists, I suggest that you take them up with them over coffee and refreshments. Join me once again in thanking Minister Hervé Lohr and Minister Marcus Roten for sharing their insights and for their availability today to be with us. And many thanks, Philippe, for preparing and moderating this discussion with the usual depth and diligence. One more applause. Don't forget to give back your headphones, and so the panelists for after the break can get ready on time. We have a lot of more to share with you today, but now it's time for a well-deserved break. Enjoy the networking, some food and refreshments, and I will see you back here, please, in half an hour so we can continue on time.